Hello, and welcome back to Occult Perspectives. This is Tyler Smith. I am going to continue going over this book, The Hiram Key, in this video. This is the third video specifically on this book. So if you haven't checked out the other two, go ahead and check those out first, because I'm going to be continuing where I left off from the end of part 2. Probably try to keep it a shorter video today. Just finish through the rest of my notes that I got done. Okay. We ended off talking about how the Jews actually had no architectural heritage. So King of Tyre hired Hiram Abiff to be the architect. Add a little more light in here. Okay. And what's interesting, it discusses in detail on page 23 how Solomon's temple was a dwelling place for Yahweh. I'm just going to go ahead and read this whole paragraph because it's quite interesting. Despite a commonly held Masonic view that this temple was a landmark in the history of building, Clark and other experts consider its style, size, and layout to be almost a carbon copy of a Sumerian temple erected for the god Ninurta, 1,000 years earlier. It was a small building, similar in size to an ordinary English village church, and believed to be less than half as big as Solomon's palace, which is interesting. The house for the god Yahweh is about half the size as King Solomon's palace, where he had his harems and such. So, yeah, it's quite interesting. From a knowledge of the purpose of churches, here we go. We can guess at where the great king's priorities lay when we discovered that the building to house his harem was at least as big as Yahweh's temple. And instead of Solomon's temple being a place where the Jews worshiped their God, it was not really constructed to be visited by men, as they say. It was quite literally the house of God, a home for Yahweh himself. So that's interesting that the King Solomon's temple, it's a carbon copy of a Sumerian god. Today, there are no physical remains of the Temple of Solomon, and no independent records of it, other than from the Bible, basically. So no one can be sure whether or not it really existed. It might be an invention of the later Jewish scribes who wrote down their verbal traditions long after the alleged building took place. And whether it's, the temple was real or not, I think history's talked about it so much, there was definitely a place that they had built. As to the I cannot think of the word I want to use. As to the details of it and the nature of it, we're not really sure. We just know that it wasn't really that big, according to what some Masonic historians have said. Okay, moving on anyway. On page 24, details of the temple interior are given. The most crucial room, the Holy of Holies, is described. What I wanted to say before was, even if the Temple of Solomon wasn't a real place historically, it's the myth of the temple that's more important. Not, people want to think of everything so literally, but the temple, King Solomon's temple in the Bible, it's more of a symbol. The temple of man, the dwelling place for the Spirit of God within man. And in the most inner recesses of the temple, you have the most crucial room, the Holy of Holies. And there is a description of it here. Holy of Holies, known in Masonic rituals the Sanctum Sanctorum, which was completely empty except for a rectangular box of shittim wood, which is acacia, 4 feet long by 2 feet wide and 2 feet high, placed in the exact center of the floor. This was the Ark of the Covenant, which contained just 3 things: 2 tablets of stone bearing the 10 Commandments, and the God Yahweh himself. On top of it was a thick sheet of solid gold and 2 wooden cherubim, themselves heavily covered with gold, with outstretched wings guarding the contents. But these cherubim were not like the chubby, little angel cherubim you think of, the little baby looking things. They would have been Egyptian in style, looking exactly like the figures depicted on the walls and sarcophagi of the pyramids. So on page 27, I don't know, I think the whole idea of God being kept in a box, it's a very strange thing. You know, it's like this angry storm god that they had to lock away and, keep hidden, or else he would wreak his havoc upon humanity. So was this a being? Was this some kind of being? Alien, extraterrestrial? Is this the real God? To me, it doesn't sound like the real God. The real God would be the source of all creation, which they're often referring to in the Bible, but we have to make the differentiation of when they're talking about the real God, ultimate source, from where we all come, or if they're talking about a microcosmic God, a God with a lowercase g, a being that is more intelligent and superior to us from where our perspective is, but is not ultimate source. So we don't want to, really give ourselves up to something that is not ultimate source. I serve, the origin point of all things. The real master. The real master is God Almighty, which exists beyond dualities and is at the source of creation. On page 27, we go back to talking about the Templars. And a lot of people try to patronize the Crusades, or they try to give them an excuse. Anyone who was involved in the Crusades, it was pretty violent. A lot of nasty stuff going on. So, the church was always like, oh, this is righteous, like, this is, God's work, like, we got to do this, but people killing people for treasures and stuff, it's, in the end, it's still pretty petty. I can understand wanting to keep dangerous technology out of the hands of the wrong people. That's definitely a noble cause, but just not a big fan on war. Let me just read a little bit in here. The Turks took control of Jerusalem at some point towards the end of the 11th century. The Turks took control of Jerusalem and banned Christians from making pilgrimages. The power of Christendom were unhappy at the state of affairs and mobilized their forces to recapture the land of Jesus. Despite the purity of the apparent motive behind them, the so-called Crusades, the battles for control of the Holy Land were hard-fought, merciless conflicts. The crude and self-seeking Christian invaders from the north believed that the Muslims were in the habit of swallowing their gold and jewelry to hide them in times of crisis. And consequently, many Muslims died in agony with their bellies torn open as white infidel fingers probed their entrails for non-existent valuables. That's pretty disgusting. The Jews of Jerusalem fared little better. They had lived happily side by side with the Muslims for hundreds of years, and on 14th of June, 1099, they died beside them. The bloodlust of the Crusaders knew no bounds. One Crusader, Raymond of Aguilers, Aguiles, was moved by the sight of the devastated city and the mutilated corpses of its residents. To quote Psalm 118, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad of it." So you always get this idea, with a lot of religions, like such a self-righteous idea, like if it's either our way or the highway, like, God wants all these people to die, like take the women and children, like it's just so crazy to me. It's like, to me, that sounds like something that's not God, that, so it's hard to say, what are you really pledging your allegiance to, when you make those contracts and stuff, and when you're serving God, what are you really serving? It's good to question those things. On page 27/page 28, the Templars. Templars, as they are now usually called, were said to have come into existence for the purpose of providing protection for the increasing flow of pilgrims as they made their journey between Jaffa and Jerusalem. All of these original knights were laymen who took an oath to live as though they were monks, in poverty, chastity, and with obedience. Initially, they didn't wear any special clothing, but they said prayers at regular intervals, and in every way they behaved as though they were members of a religious order. I mean, it pretty much was. The Templars were a religious order. They were just military as well. But as we learn here a little bit later, they had different branches within the Templars. Page 28. Rather than pilgrims, the early Templars were rather treasure hunters, we found out. Because I don't think there was really anything in their... there's no evidence that the founding Templars ever gave protection to pilgrims. On the other hand, there's conclusive proof that they did conduct extensive excavations under the ruins of Herod's temple. So there's not really, if you look in the charge and stuff, as we'll learn later on, there's not really too much about protecting pilgrims. It seems like the real motive was more of like a treasure hunt. The Templars were really treasure hunters. The real task of the 9 Knights was to carry out research in order to obtain certain relics and manuscripts, which contain the essence of the secret traditions of Judaism, and ancient Egypt, some of which probably went back to the days of Moses. That's a quote from G. Delaforge from a book called The Templar Tradition in the Age of Aquarius. And then Graham Hancock also used that quote later on, or information in his book. Yep, in his book, it says the sign and the seal. He quotes that. So the founding member of the Templars was basically Hugh de Payens. Hugh, Depayens. He's the one that seems to be the guy who's really responsible for bringing that original order together. All right, where do they start mentioning him? Page 30. All must have gone reasonably well year after year as they tunneled through solid rock in this treasure hunt, itching closer and closer to the base of the Holy of Holies. Then something changed, something happened which changed the basic plan. Something a little less than coincidence. Hugh de Payens' journey west to find recruits for the first time happened just months after the death of their benefactor Baldwin in October 1126. Had they run out of funds and food before their unknown task was completed, or did they wait for Baldwin to die in order to cut him out of any share of the treasure? Interesting. Okay. And then, basically, once the Templars officially get integrated into the Catholic Church, okay. So this Hugh de Payens guy, he basically travels and he was accompanied on his travel with the guy who was destined to become the future Saint Bernard. Let me just make sure this is the travel. Is this the travel out? There he wrote. Okay, so some of the knights had been left back. 7 had been left back on the Temple Mount as Hugh de Payens was accompanied on his journey by André de Montbard, who was the uncle of the very young but highly influential abbot of Clairvaux. That's the future Saint Bernard. So basically, it was this guy's uncle. It must have been this family connection that took them first to Bernard. He was impressed what he heard about the order from his uncle, and Bernard wanted, he basically wanted help on this campaign, some assistance. The future Saint Bernard quickly brought the order to the attention of the Pope Honorius II, asking that these knights should be provided with a constitution of their own, and this lays out requirements for conduct and practice, which would give them the legitimacy and define the status within the church. So this is really what got them officially, under the rule of the Catholic Church, is this rule. So they were considered, an official body. And this was finally granted on the 31st of January, 1128. Before I go on, there's an interesting little quote here in the bottom of page 32. Bernard's words promoting their campaign for assistance left little doubt about his opinions of these knights from Jerusalem. They go not headlong into battle, but with care and foresight, peacefully, as true children of Israel. But as soon as the fight has begun, they rush without delay upon the foe and know no fear. One has often put to flight 1,000, 2, 10,000. Gentler than lambs and grimmer than lions, theirs is the mildness of monks and the valor of knights. So the Templars really were like fearless fighters, and they were never allowed themselves to be taken prisoner. They would always pretty much fight to the death, unless they're outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1 or something crazy, and they're just all not going to make it. Typically, if it's that bad, they would retreat. Okay, page 31. And within this new rule that the Templars had just gotten, this constitution or whatever, nowhere was there any mention of pilgrims or their protection. That's really strange, because the whole point of the order was essentially to protect these pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land. And at this time, the Templars could wear their own mantles, which was pure white. Okay. Just making sure I'm not missing anything. So basically, when a person they joined the order, all candidates were required to have been born in wedlock, be of noble birth, be free from any vow or tie, and be of sound body. Upon admission, the accepted brother owned only his sword and nothing else. He had no identity apart from his sword, which he dedicated to the service of the order. When he died, his grave carried no inscription, being marked only with a rectangular stone into which the shape of his sword was carved. So as you can see, joining the Templars was definitely a very big commitment. The Templars quickly gained a reputation, a lot of support, many donations. Yeah, they basically just caught the attention of everyone really, really quick. Even though the new members of the order had to follow this rule, it's unsure whether the founding members really did, because Hughes de Pine was married, he stayed married to Catherine de St. Clair the whole time, a Scottish woman of Norman descent, and set up the first Templar preceptory outside the Holy Land on her family's land in Scotland. This would turn out to be really important later on. That whole family, the Sinclair family, if you've ever heard about them, they are pretty crucial in the history of a lot of this stuff. Freemasonry, the new country in general, America, the founding. I think the Sinclairs knew about America way before, like, Christopher Columbus did. Like, that whole story's been botched up, and the real history's kind of been hidden. That's something we can get into later as well. Interesting note, page 32, entrants were obliged to cut their hair, but were forbidden to cut their beards. That's odd. Page 32 again. The Templars created, now, we were amazed to find that about 10 years after granting this original rule, they were granted with the Latin rule. The Templars began to think so highly of themselves that they unilaterally developed a French rule to replace the former one in the working language of the members of the order. The fact that they just kind of replaced the old rule with their new rule shows that they really did have a lot of power. It did away with the requirement for a probationary year for novices and turned one highly important rule on its head, instantly changing the legal basis of the order. This right here, this is interesting. The instruction in the Latin rule, and instruction read, moreover, where non-excommunicated knights are gathered, you must go. However, in the translated and amended French rule, the same sentence became, so the Latin rule was the original. And in the French rule, they replaced that line with, we command you to go where excommunicated knights are gathered. This can only imply that they were outside Vatican law. There can be no possibility that this was simply an error of translation, as the clerics at the time were working in their own language, not an unfamiliar script. So, yeah, that's kind of strange. Blah, 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 blah. So basically, they ended up getting too much power. They thought, they're kind of becoming hot shit or whatever. The Templars and, the Pope and Philip, conspired to go against them. And they moved in on the order, bringing it to its knees in one terrible day, Friday the 13th, October 1307. Ever since that day, the number 13 has been considered unlucky, and a Friday the 13th of any month has become a date to keep any overly superstitious person indoors clinging to their lucky rabbit's foot. Not sure what the whole rabbit's foot thing is about. Sounds like some voodoo magic or something like that. On page 33, too, they talk about a small interpretation on the seal of the order. If you've ever looked at the original like logo of the Knights Templar, it's just two knights riding on one horse, which is kind of a misconception. Because of the truth, in the French rule, which was the second rule that they made, Templars made, a master must have 4 horses and 1 chaplain brother and 1 clerk with 3 horses. Yeah, the French rule, however, states that the master must have 4 horses and 1 chaplain brother and 1 clerk with 3 horses and 1 sergeant brother with 2 horses and 1 gentleman valet to carry his shield and lance with 1 horse. Clearly, there was no shortage of available mounts. So the author's interpretation of what it might mean is that the 2 people riding on the horse really represent the 2 grades of the knights. The more advanced were in the inner order, while those in the outer order kind of took the back seat. Which makes sense, because every like order or group has like an inner and an outer order. If we refer back to Modern Magic once again, just for a moment, we have here the definition of inner and outer order while we're at it. Okay, the outer order. Magical organizations such as orders and covens, the outer order consists of a wider membership wherein people are taught the basic theories and concepts of the group. If people last through the trials and ordeals of this training, proving their worthiness and dedication, they move to the inner order. And then, yeah, there's the beginning. It shows the outer order, and then there's all this stuff you got to learn until you get to the inner order. Magical organizations such as orders or covens, the inner order is an in-group where the most potent secrets are taught to and practiced by members who have been through the trials and ordeals of the outer order and prove their worthiness. So yeah, you just want to make sure that people are trustworthy, they are they're good at what they do, they're efficient enough in the work, and they have the understanding, and they're not just going in, not really knowing what they're getting themselves into. Okay. Yeah, we're already at 27 minutes. I was trying to keep this video short, but I think it's ended up being the longest one I've had so far, and I haven't even really covered those many notes. So, this Hiram Key series, it's going to take me a while. And I will probably, like I said before, deviate from this little series and go back to Modern Magic and maybe get into ceremonial magic a little bit more. But I'm going to continue on writing the notes on these and on the Hiram Key and going over that. So let's go ahead and finish this out. On page 33, 34, not only were there knights in the Templars, but there were 2 lesser classes besides these Fool Brothers. The first were sergeants, and they were more like a working class. And the knights typically would come from the nobility. That was the main source for the knights. And these sergeants, they undertook positions like grooms, stewards, sentries, and general support troops. Like the knights, they wore a red cross, but the mantle was dark brown rather than white, reflecting their lack of purity in relation to knights of the order. Kind of like the whole concept we get with like the working class today and the aristocracy, or like, the royals, or, the really rich people, or there's always just this, idea that like, just too much self-righteousness a lot of the time. It's like we need to learn to be humble, like we're all really equal. Some of us are just lucky and we get, our hands on like really good information, or we grow up in places, that we have a loving, caring environment. But we should not take those things for granted, and we shouldn't like feel that we're superior to others. I always thought that was kind of weird. It's more about what you give. The other group comprised the clerics. Now the clerics are more like the spiritual people in the group. They looked after the spiritual needs of the knights. They were the only literate members of the order and were themselves priests, taking care of record keeping and communication, sometimes writing in very complex codes. and they were distinguished by wearing the Templar cross on a green mantle. Okay. So it must have been a red cross on a green mantle, from what I'm understanding. Okay. All right. Just a couple more things. On page 34, these clerics, what's interesting is when they would do the Eucharist, like the same way a modern-day priest was, the body of Christ, it was important not to soil it even with the dirt of profane day-to-day activities, and white gloves were worn to keep their hands clean enough to handle the body of God. This wearing of white gloves was to us an obvious parallel with modern Freemasons who always wear white gloves. Not all lodges do this, like the wearing of white gloves. We don't, actually. But it's a very common thing, and I think all lodges used to have to wear white gloves. Like, that was part of the dress code. So there could be some tie to that, most definitely. Oh, here's another thing I didn't even write in the notes for this one. Another echo of current Masonic practice lies the Templars' use of sheepskin, which, you should, if you're a Mason, that should sound familiar, the lambskin or white leather apron. The use of sheepskin as their only permitted form of decoration, as well as the requirement of their rule that they were to wear tight sheepskin breeches beneath their outer clothing at all times as a symbol of innocence and chastity. Interesting. That's an interesting thought in this age of personal hygiene, because these conscientious knights did not remove their breeches even to wash themselves. That's really gross. After a few days, let alone many decades that many of them spent under the desert sun, their chastity must have been totally guaranteed. No kidding. All right. The Templar flag is basically contains black and white. It's like, I think it's split like horizontally like this on the flag, and then I believe it's black on the top and usually white on the bottom. I would Google image that, but I'm using my phone to record this, so I'm not going to do that. And these black and white cubes or squares are symbolic of being in darkness and moving to light. And they talk about this in this book, maybe there being in connection to that with the checkerboard floor in the Masonic Lodge, which really just represents like duality, and you're supposed to walk over the checkerboard floor. The floor, it is the floor. That's why it's duality. It's not the heights of the lodge. It's like it's down there on the ground floor. Duality, yes, no, in, out, up, down. You can't really avoid it, but in the cases, like drama and stuff like that, things that we can bypass, we should try to do that as often as we possibly can. Try to escape those kind of dualities as much as possible. And then the very last thing I have here is actually, I'm just going to read this conclusion at the end of this chapter because it summarizes everything really nicely that we've been talking about in this video and the last video. We now knew that the Templars had painstakingly excavated the ruins of Herod's temple and that the downfall of the order came as the result of accusations of heresy. If the Templars did hold heretical beliefs and conduct strange rituals, it seemed to be a real possibility that these could have originated with a document or documents found by them during these treasure hunts. Had these 12th century knights uncovered any ancient texts, they would have been in an almost unique position at that time to interpret and appreciate them. Whilst the knights themselves were believed to have been illiterate, their clerics would have been able to read and write in many languages. And they were known for their abilities to create and break ciphers. We pursued this avenue as our best guess, unaware that evidence of a Templar find was almost just under our noses, in the ritual of a Masonic degree that neither of us had joined. Okay, so yeah, next time we'll be starting on chapter 4, the Gnostic connection. So we'll be getting into like Gnostic Christianity and all that stuff, which is a fascinating subject as it ties into Freemasonry and Templars as well. So, alrighty, this has been a pretty long video. Sorry about that. As I've said before, just trying to get the light and knowledge out. Hope you all have a wonderful day. If you like my video, please like and subscribe. Peace and take care.